Avatar, The Last Airbender was a huge part of my childhood. I feel like it shaped much of who I am, calibrated my moral compass, and showed a world that I desperately wanted to be a part of. But, in truth, I didn't actually watch much of it when I was a kid. I used to rush home after primary school because it started just as school finished. And even though I lived quite literally across the road from my school, I'd rarely ever catch more than 10 minutes of it. Most days, this would be all I'd catch. That music was always bittersweet. It meant I had missed out on the show, but I loved the music. And from those small snippets of episodes and the credits, which I'd always watch, I constructed a whole universe inspired by the show. That's what actually shaped my childhood, the impression it made on me. So when I got the chance to watch it properly when I was in high school, I had apprehensions. Here was a fiction I had woven for myself that I dearly loved. Could the real thing possibly match that? Ultimately, it was the music that convinced me to watch it. If I could appreciate nothing else, I could at least hear the credits music again. And so, I began to watch it. The first episode was decent. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't quite as magical as I'd imagined it to be. Neither was the second. But the third was far beyond anything I could have hoped for. Why? Well, it wasn't for the fight scenes, as well choreographed as they are. It wasn't for the art that went into the series, which is consistently incredible. It was for the fact that I suddenly noticed how much it respected me as the viewer. The fact that, although its target audience was primarily children, it didn't treat its audience with any less respect than it would have if it were aimed at adults. And indeed, it has a greater respect for its audience than a lot of the shows that are aimed at adults. If this video is going to make any sense, I need to pretty much spoil all of the third episode. So if you've been meaning to check out the series and want to go in blind, now's the time to leave. That said, although this is one of my favourite episodes, it wouldn't ruin the show at large, nor the first series to have this episode spoiled. The series as a whole is far greater than the sum of its parts. So the choice is yours. The third episode of Avatar has two main threads and a third that's very brief but also very important. The first is Aang's visit to what was his home 100 years ago. His companions, Sokka and Katara, have heard claims that the Fire Nation have killed all the airbenders, but Aang doesn't believe them. The second follows Zuko and his run-in with Commander Zhao. Although many subsequent episodes follow Zuko, this is the first to introduce him in a sympathetic light, particularly through his distaste for the incredibly smug Zhao. Finally, and I think this is something of a linchpin for the episode, there is a brief flashback that introduces us to the Southern Air Temple while Aang lived there, and to Monk Gyatso, Aang's mentor and friend. What I loved about this episode, and what made me notice the respect Avatar has for me as its audience, is that with each setup, you were the one to make the connection. There's a lot they could have done that I've seen other shows do in order to make sure that their young audience would understand exactly what was going on. They might have had Gyatso write a message to Aang before his death, rather than trust that the audience could link this skeleton to Gyatso thanks to the distinctive necklace. They might have had Zuko complain about how his father never gave him any praise or encouragement, instead of showing the effects of this lack of a positive relationship through how eager he is to prove himself and his reaction to the praise Iroh gives him. Kids aren't dumb. When shows jammed in exposition or explained exactly what it was that they had already just shown, it frustrated me. There seemed to be next to no shows that were aimed at kids that actually understood that said kids weren't stupid. That's not to say that there aren't aspects of the show that might not work for an adult audience as well as they do for a child audience. But for the most part, I think the show, especially in its later seasons, still holds up remarkably well for older audiences. A lot of that is due to the respect it shows to the other parts of the show, namely the fight choreography and the art. Now, I realise I literally just said that I didn't love this episode for the fight scenes or its artistic direction, but they certainly contribute to what makes the show itself great as a whole, if not directly to the reason I noticed its greatness. Case in point, take a look at the fight between Zuko and Zhao here. It looks like a martial arts performance. Ignoring the flames bursting from clenched fists, it's very much grounded. The creators of the show styled each bending discipline after real forms of martial arts, and it really shows. More than just a bunch of flashy maneuvers, the fight has a real sense of pace and rhythm. It feels very tangible in a way most action scenes on TV don't. See the way Zuko steps forward and backwards during the different stages of the fight. See how advantages are pressed and how Zhao falls after Zuko breaks his stance. I may not know much about fighting, but damn if that isn't fantastic choreography. In the same way that the fighting is heavily inspired by real forms and movements, so too are the various cultures and styles of dress represented in Avatar. The colour schemes in particular are fantastic. The oranges and yellows of Aang's loose flowing clothing, as inspired by Buddhist monks, contrasts wonderfully with the blues and whites of the water tribe's thick winter clothing. And this contributes to the sense that each cultural background is distinct. The creators don't fake that either. Different characters throughout the series have distinct personalities, typically influenced directly, but not exclusively, by the country they grew up in, and these traits are ever present throughout each character arc. Aang, for example, frequently has trouble facing things head-on, preferring to find alternative solutions wherever possible, and this is both one of his greatest flaws and strengths. Each character's personal philosophy and ideals are shown to be better or worse than the others depending on the situation. Although the show is pretty wrapped up in Eastern philosophies, it's always self-aware, and it paints a richer picture of these philosophies by showing their faults as well as their strengths. Almost nothing in the show is shown to be perfectly good or totally evil, and the moral lessons at the conclusion of many episodes are never quite so simple as to become on the nose or dull. The world of Avatar is so much richer for this moral complexity, and more appealing too. It's a world to get lost in, with light humour, surprisingly dark moments, and everything in between. I think it's an absolute masterpiece, and it remains one of my favourite shows, for the simple fact that it respects its audience in a way few shows do. Rather than portray a simple sadness in Aang after learning of Gyatso's death, instead we are shown an incredible anger mixed with fear and a touch of despair in a character who previously had been happy and optimistic almost to a fault. Zuko isn't just angry because Zhao insulted him, but also because he's eager to prove himself after an as-yet unspecified failure in his past. It would be so easy to strip these complexities out to make for a simpler viewing experience for a young audience, but instead the team behind the show chose to trust that audience, and that trust was mirrored by my own in response. If you haven't tried to watch Avatar: The Last Airbender yet, I'd highly recommend giving it a go, even if you don't fall into the expected demographic. The art, music, writing and characters are all wonderful on their own, but seeing, for example, Zuko's huge 3-season arc is just wonderful. The show is far more than the sum of its parts, as good as each of those parts are. I'd love to know what you think. Have you seen Avatar: The Last Airbender? What did you think of it? Was it as good as I said, or just a pretty average kids show? Let me know in the comments below. Cheers, have a good one.